watching this. We're going to go through these wines today, which are in your current club release. We've got the 2017 Syrah and the 2017 Petite Sirah, and then the 2016 Deux Barriques is an add-on. Both of these wines are the Petite Sirah and the Syrah are from our estate, grown here. The vines were planted back in '72, so they're coming up on the 50-year anniversary of their planting. So, yeah, you got anything to add to that?
Let's taste some wine, right? If you have some at home, feel free to pop it open and taste the wine. This will be fun. The first of many videos to come, I hope. Let's do this.
Yeah, so we're going to go ahead and decant these wines. We think it's important. They're young wines, and they're pretty big wines in their own right. But what I like to do when I'm decanting wines is I don't decant the whole thing. I actually like to decant about half of it, see what the difference is after a little bit of time from the decanter to the bottle. It's something fun to do. It gives you a little insight, makes you feel like a professional, impresses your friends.
I tend to drink straight from the bottle myself. That's also fun to do, but completely up to you.
This is true. I've seen it. So let's go ahead and get this started here.
Oh, look at the color.
Syrah.
These are three big boys.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And if you don't have a decanter, you can
use
a vase or whatever else
True.
you have around the house.
I've seen people use old milk jars. So you want to try some out of the bottle and then try some out of the decanter? Ideally, you would let this sit for a little bit of time, let it get a little more oxygen. You can, splash it around in here, give it a little more than you would normally give a wine. Especially since these are so big, we don't necessarily encourage this for, say, like an older Pinot or something like that. But for these wines, it's important to get them a little oxygen. Yeah, for sure.
And since this is kind of a special occasion, you're going to see me and Mike do something we never, ever do, and that is do the classic winemaker pose. You ready?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
There's no laughter. This is not funny.
It's a red wine, I can tell.
Here we go, Syrah. Classic back notes of tar and
Oh, wow. The spice right off the nose. A lot of licorice. This vintage, I think, has a lot of licorice to it. It doesn't have as much, it has a tarry notes, but not as heavy as usual. It's got some nice, actually light spices to it.
just a little bit about the fermentation process and what we do here. This wine is one of the toughest wines we make as far as it needs a lot of attention right during fermentation. All wines do, but this one especially because they're notorious for reducing or creating a burnt tire or a boiled egg quality. And if you're not on top of it, it can stick around. You don't pick up any of that in these wines now because we've done our job. But it is something that we pay particular attention to during harvest, and 17 was no exception. Little more grip, because it is a young wine, you would hope to have some grip in there, some tannin, some large phenolics sort of showing themselves. But the decanter will help with that, and so will food, and so will time in the bottle. It's not a fault, but it is something that we expect to see in a wine, that like this. It's an artisan wine, really. I mean, it's made by the two of us. Just a little history, we've been working together for over 20 years in the biz since we were the 1900s, really. Yeah, we're getting really good at this.
And we're best buddies.
Bandmates.
We fish together, we play music together. What would you pair with that? What's your dream meal with that wine?
I put, I think the tasting notes, I could be mistaken, but I think the tasting notes say any grilled meats or anything that grandma cooks.
Ah, yes.
Yeah, so.
I was thinking a grilled pork chop would be epic.
Yeah.
A smoky note to it.
it stands up really well to cracked pepper and stuff like that as well. It's got a little bit of that in there as well for
Maybe some lamb.
maybe some lamb if you
Lamb
if you so
season.
choose. It is lamb season. Yeah, we're happy with it. It's got a really neat blackberry, just a hint of blackberry right at the very front, but which is sort of taken out by the baking spices, if you will, the nutmegs, the allspices. Part of that's barrel, but a big chunk of it is just where the vines are grown. Next wine we're going to be going over is our 2017 Petite Sirah. About half of the acreage here at the estate is planted to Petite Sirah, again from the early 70s. A lot of questions on why there's part of the reason is it grows really well on this northeastern corner of the Russian River Valley, which is, Russian River Valley is known for its Pinots and Chardonnays, but this was planted in the early 70s, and part of that reason was the Fabianos had some, the neighbors had some that were mixed in with Carignan and some of those old Italian blocks where they had those essentially mixed varieties out there that grew really well, and Petite Sirah was one of them. It's pretty resistant to disease, it's resistant to mildew and some of the other pressures that come along with these wines. So 2017, again, we just spoke about the Syrah, but the 2017 Petite stayed out a little bit longer. It takes a little bit longer to ripen because the older vines are not nearly as vigorous and they don't put out the canopy that the Syrah does, which is essentially the solar panels for the vines. When they go through photosynthesis, that's what's moving these wines along, or these grapes along at that point in time. So all they're trying to do is ripen a seed, and we're actually paying particular attention to the seeds and the skins at that point. And then so we picked this one just a little bit later than the Syrah. Its fermentation is just as critical as the Syrah, as are all the wines we make here, but this one we really have to be careful and cautious about building too much tannin, too much structure. I use this analogy quite a bit. It's like over-steeping tea. Some people really enjoy tea to sit in the hot water for a long period of time, and some like it to be on the front end a lot less time. That's our job at this point in time during harvest, is we are actually trying to make the perfect cup of tea, and we do that by punching down and tasting every single time we punch down, and then figuring out, okay, the structure is where we want it, and then we pull it off its skins, press it out. That stops the extraction process, and then we're left with this. Got anything to add to that?
Just, Mike was mentioning fermentation, and it's really one of the critical things that we do is we make our wines in a very old world style. We do have several stainless steel tanks, we've got some fancy pumps and such, but fermentations for all these wines are done in 1-ton plastic bins, individual bins. So Mike and I, actually there's no pumps involved. Mike and I personally every day, 3 times a day, walk around up to 40 different lots of grapes will be on the crush pad fermenting, and we'll individually hand punch down the grapes. We don't use any additives, no enzymes, no pigments, no added tannins. Like Mike was saying, we treasure our vineyards and we treasure the grapes we bring in here, and the last thing we want to do is mess them up and put a lot of weird stuff in them. So it's but I think that it's a lot of work, a lot of extra work, but I think it shows in the wines. That's how we get these flavors. But let's see.
Yeah, check it out.
Once again, black.
Yeah, on the tasting notes that come with your club shipment, you'll see I put something in there about not wearing white when you're drinking this wine. It's only for professionals, and even then there's going to be an occasional accident, and it will ruin the shirt.
Not just shirts, this is the only wine we make that actually stains stainless steel. It will not come off.
Good point.
It's amazing. For
Again,
a wine, a lot of brightness.
A lot of brightness.
A lot of brightness.
And I think we nailed the structure thing.
We nailed it. Virtual high five.
One of the things that you'll get from this wine is obviously a similar notes, or a family bloodline, if you will, because they're grown right next to each other. They're totally different beasts. We farm them differently. We make decisions based on canopy management that do in the Syrah that we don't do in the Petite Sirah. One of those is that we leave a little more canopy on the grapes itself. A lot of people in the biz remove leaves on the morning side on everything. We don't on this wine, specifically because an old mentor of ours and one of our old bosses, Fred Payne, pointed out that it's one of the first to burn. It's one of the first to get sunburn in even something over 85 degrees. And so if you leave those out there, it's like putting a little small white child on the beach all day. It's going to get burned really bad. So what we do is we leave leaves to give what's essentially doppled sunlight. So if it does get sunlight, it only gets it for a portion of the day as opposed to half the day or 3/4 of the day. It's one of the things that stuck with me because it's when you actually eat these grapes, the skin feels really thick and it feels really tough, but it's not. It's really, really vulnerable. Actually, Pinot Noir does better in the sun than Petite Sirah does. Maybe not over the long haul, but for those extra hot days when we get over 100 degrees, and which happens quite a bit, the Petite Sirah is one of the first to show damage. So here we have the 2016 Deux Barriques. We've actually decanted a little bit of this as well. This is a 50-50 blend that we do at harvest. Previous vintages, starting in 14, those were blended after the fact. We decided that we wanted to see them married together in tank, which has really shown a lot of improvement on the integration of the wine and how they react together. Zinfandel, 50-50 Zinfandel from our neighbors vineyard next door, and Petite Sirah from the estate here, which we tried. So you'll see some similarities, even though they're different vintages. You'll see some similarities between these wines because they're family. One of the things about this wine that there's a story about it. I'm sure you guys have all heard it. It was an accident initially. Somebody poked a hole. A previous winemaker poked a hole in a bin and had to move it over to another bin so it didn't leak on the floor. So he wanted to save the wine. He thought it was the same bin. It wasn't the same bin. It was a bin of Zinfandel, and he had punctured a bin of Petite Sirah. So it became this, your peanut butter and my chocolate sort of thing.
And now it's a cult classic.
And now it's a classic. I mean, people show up for the release of this. We make a whopping 2 barrels of each of these wines, so it's 4 barrels total, which gives us about just over 80 cases of this. It's we tend to treat this one with a little different approach, and that approach is the hands-off approach because it has a little bit of the Zinfandel in there. So the only racking that wine gets during its 26 months in barrel is right before harvest. Right before bottoming, which allows a lot of integration for those 2 different varietals to go ahead and sort of marry each other, if you will. Anything to add?
Just in sipping this right now, it just occurred to me, this one really, to my mind, shows off, again, the fermentation process, where one of the key things we do here at Christopher Creek is the use of native yeast, or wild yeast. We do incorporate some commercial yeast into the process, but all of our fermentations start with the wild yeast, and that's critical. At least go a few days with the wild yeast, and what that gives to the wine is a certain character. It goes back to the vineyard, it goes back to wildness, and you get a certain rangy quality. It just puts life into the grape. If straight commercial yeast, you get straight, clean, squeaky clean wines, and that's something we're not interested in. We want some little funky edges and notes and different things, and that really shows up in this wine. You get that beautiful cocoa dusted blueberry character too with that, but with the little kind of shadings of other stuff that you only get from wild yeast fermentations.
Wild yeast fermentations is, some people call it resident yeast. We had a guest come through and chuckle and say squatter yeast. It's all the yeast that's on our equipment. It comes from the vineyard, it comes from the equipment, it comes from pretty much everything we do, one of the things we sort of pride ourselves on is not being really aggressive with anything we do. And so it seems like a natural step to go ahead and allow fermentation to happen on its own, which means that we have to be really good guardians of those bins, of those tanks, or whatever. That's where the experience comes in. Toot toot our own horn. We spend a lot of time tasting these wines. We do what's called taste-based winemaking, and we build wines that we impress ourselves with and hope you enjoy them as well. But wild yeast allows us to differentiate ourselves and actually really highlight the sense of place, which, having done travels through Italy and France, that's the one thing that we took away from each one of these spots is they all tasted so much different than their neighbor, even though in some cases they share the same vineyard, but they were completely different wines. And a lot of that's from resident yeast or native yeast or whatever you want to call it. We're not using cultivated yeast. We're not buying yeast and dumping it in to these wines. We allow them to happen naturally. That concludes our tasting of your current release club wines. Just wanted to say thanks so much for joining us. We're going to continue to do this with each club release, and actually we'll have some more stuff coming down the line. Just keep everybody sort of connected to Christopher Creek. Thanks so much for your support, and continue to support small business around the nation. Cheers.
Cheers.
Cheers.